Welcome to the Sleep Hours. Tonight we'll journey far beyond the stars and into one of the most imaginative worlds ever created in animation, Steven Universe. Beneath its bright colors, catchy songs, and charming characters lies an epic story spanning thousands of years, a tale of powerful empires, ancient rebellions, cosmic mysteries, and the enduring strength of love and compassion. So settle in, take a slow breath, and let the calm waves of Beach City wash over your thoughts. As the night grows quieter, we'll explore the hidden history of the gems and the extraordinary events that shaped an entire universe. There's nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. Simply relax, listen, and allow the story to gently guide you towards sleep. Long before Steven Universe was born, long before Beach City existed, and long before anyone on Earth had ever heard the word gem, there was a civilization unlike any other in the cosmos. Far beyond the stars, scattered across countless worlds, existed a race of beings made not from flesh and blood, but from light itself. These beings were known as gems. At first glance, they appeared human, but beneath their forms were gemstones that projected physical bodies made entirely of hard light. They did not age. They did not become sick. They did not need sleep. In many ways, they seemed immortal. Their society was vast, ancient, and incredibly organized. Every gem had a purpose from the moment they came into existence. Some were made to build, others were made to fight. Some gathered information, while others governed entire planets. Individuality was not encouraged. Questions were rarely asked. The system functioned because every gem was expected to play a role and never stray from it. At the center of this immense empire stood 4 rulers known as the Diamonds: White Diamond, Yellow Diamond, Blue Diamond, and Pink Diamond. To the rest of Gem Society, these rulers seemed almost godlike. Their power stretched across entire galaxies. Their decisions shaped the destinies of countless worlds. When a diamond spoke, millions listened. For ages, the empire expanded. Whenever the gems discovered a new planet, they transformed it into something useful. Massive structures rose from the ground. Resources were harvested. New gems were created. The process repeated again and again across the stars. To Gem Society, this was progress. To the planets being transformed, however, it often meant something very different. Life rarely survived the process. Forests disappeared, oceans changed, entire ecosystems vanished beneath the growing machinery of the Gem Empire. Yet few gems ever questioned whether this was right. Most had never known anything else. Among the diamonds, one ruler stood apart from the others. Pink Diamond was the youngest, the smallest, and often the least respected. While Yellow commanded authority and Blue inspired loyalty, Pink was frequently treated like an inexperienced child. The older Diamonds often dismissed her ideas and limited her responsibilities. Whenever she wanted more freedom, they reminded her that she still had much to learn. For thousands of years, Pink dreamed of proving herself. She wanted her own colony, her own planet, her own chance to show that she could be just as capable as the others. Eventually, after endless requests, the opportunity finally arrived. A distant blue and green world had been selected for colonization. Its name was Earth. At first, Earth seemed no different from the countless planets the gems had already transformed. It contained resources, it had strategic value, and most importantly, it could produce more gems. Pink Diamond was thrilled. This was her chance, her colony, her responsibility, her future. But when she finally arrived on Earth, something unexpected happened. Instead of seeing only resources and territory, she saw life. She saw oceans that sparkled beneath the sun. She saw forests stretching beyond the horizon, She saw animals roaming free through landscapes, untouched by gem technology. And for perhaps the first time in her life, Pink Diamond became curious. Curiosity was not something gem society valued very highly. Gems were expected to follow orders, not wonder about them. They were designed with specific purposes and were rarely encouraged to think beyond those boundaries. Yet Earth seemed determined to challenge everything Pink Diamond believed she knew. The more time she spent exploring the planet, the more fascinated she became. She wandered through forests where sunlight filtered through endless layers of leaves. She watched rainstorms roll across distant mountains. She listened to birds sing songs that had never been written, rehearsed, or assigned. Every living thing seemed to exist for its own reasons, growing and changing in ways that felt completely foreign to gem culture. Life on Earth was unpredictable, messy, temporary, and somehow beautiful because of it. For the first time, Pink began to question the purpose of the empire she served. As plans for Earth's colonization moved forward, enormous kindergartens were established. These were massive facilities where new gems would emerge from the planet itself. To create more gems, the natural resources of Earth had to be drained away. At first, Pink tried to ignore what was happening. She told herself this was simply how things worked. This was how every colony had been built. This was what the diamonds expected. But the longer she watched, the harder it became. Entire landscapes were scarred by gem technology. Areas once filled with life became barren and lifeless. Each new project brought Earth closer to the same fate as countless other worlds that had come before it. And deep down, Pink didn't want that to happen. The problem was that convincing the other diamonds would not be easy. She approached them more than once, suggesting that perhaps Earth should be left alone. Perhaps this particular world was different. Perhaps its life deserved protection. The responses were never what she hoped for. Yellow Diamond viewed the colony as an important investment. Blue Diamond saw no reason to halt progress. White Diamond barely seemed interested in the discussion at all. To them, Earth was simply another planet, another resource, another step in the Empire's expansion. Pink's concerns were dismissed again and again. Eventually, she realized that asking politely would change nothing. If Earth was going to survive, she would need another solution. And so one of the most important secrets in Steven Universe history began to take shape. A secret identity, a new persona, a symbol that would eventually inspire an entire rebellion. Pink Diamond created the identity of Rose Quartz. At first, Rose Quartz was little more than a disguise, a way for Pink to observe events from a different perspective, a way to speak freely without carrying the weight of her title. But something unexpected happened. The longer she lived as Rose Quartz, the more she began to feel like Rose Quartz. Unlike a diamond, Rose could laugh without expectations. She could explore without permission. She could speak to ordinary gems as equals rather than subjects. For perhaps the first time in her existence, she felt free. And it was during this period that Rose began meeting gems whose lives had also been shaped by the Empire's rigid rules. One of them was a pearl, not just any pearl, but the pearl who had spent ages serving Pink Diamond herself. Pearls were expected to be elegant servants. They existed to obey, to assist, to remain loyal without question. Yet this pearl possessed something unusual. She admired Rose. She believed in her. And over time, she became Rose's closest companion. Together they explored Earth and witnessed its beauty firsthand. They stood beneath starlit skies. They watched waves crash against rocky shores. They observed humanity's distant ancestors struggling, surviving, and slowly building lives of their own. With every passing year, Rose became more convinced that Earth deserved a future. Soon others began to listen. Some gems were already unhappy with the Empire's strict hierarchy. They longed for freedom. They wanted the chance to define themselves rather than follow the purpose assigned to them at birth. Rose Quartz offered them something revolutionary, a choice. And in an empire built entirely upon obedience, choice was one of the most powerful ideas imaginable. Slowly, quietly, a resistance began to form. The first sparks of what would become the crystal gems had been lit. And before long, those sparks would grow into a conflict that would change the fate of Earth forever. The growing resistance remained hidden for time. Rose Quartz and her followers knew they could not challenge the Gem Empire through strength alone. Against the power of the diamonds, they were vastly outnumbered. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for with conviction. They believed Earth was worth protecting. They believed that life, in all its unpredictable forms, deserved the chance to continue. And perhaps most importantly, they believed gems could become more than what they had been created to be. As centuries passed, more gems joined Rose's cause. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of frustration with the Empire's rigid structure. One by one, they chose freedom over obedience. The crystal gems were no longer just an idea. They were becoming a movement. But secrets rarely remain hidden forever. Eventually, word of the rebellion reached Homeworld. The Diamonds learned that a group of gems was actively resisting the colonization of Earth. Worse still, they discovered that this rebellion was gaining supporters. What had once seemed like a minor inconvenience was now becoming a genuine threat to their authority. The response was swift. Homeworld prepared for war. Ships arrived from distant corners of the galaxy. Powerful gems descended upon Earth. Soldiers gathered. Commanders received orders. Across the planet, the first signs of a conflict, unlike anything Earth had ever witnessed, began to emerge. And standing at the center of it all was Rose Quartz, a leader carrying a secret so enormous that its truth would remain hidden for thousands of years. A war was coming. A war that would reshape the future of gems, humans, and the entire universe itself. And as we continue our journey next time, we'll witness the beginning of the legendary Gem War, the rise of the crystal gems, and the choices that would forever change the fate of Earth. The moment the Gem Empire decided to crush the rebellion, Earth became the center of a conflict that would echo across thousands of years. What had begun as a quiet resistance was now a full-scale war. Across forests, mountains, deserts, and coastlines, gems battled for control of the planet. Brilliant flashes of light illuminated the night skies. Ancient structures rose from the ground. Powerful weapons, unlike anything humans would one day create, clashed across landscapes that still exist in fragments even during Stephen's time. For the humans living on Earth, these events must have seemed impossible to understand. At this point in history, humanity was still young. Small groups of people lived simple lives, completely unaware that an interstellar conflict was unfolding around them. They could not know that the future of their world was being decided by beings from the stars. For Rose Quartz, every day brought new challenges. The rebellion was growing, but so were the forces sent by Homeworld. Many gems still viewed Rose as a dangerous criminal. To them, she was threatening the natural order of gem society. The Diamonds had ruled for ages, and countless gems believed their authority should never be questioned. Yet Rose continued to inspire those who followed her. She spoke about freedom, individuality, and the idea that a gem's purpose should not be determined the moment they emerge from the ground. These ideas spread slowly at first, then faster and faster. The crystal gems became more than a resistance movement. They became a symbol of possibility. Among Rose's closest allies was Pearl. To most gems, Pearl would have seemed an unlikely revolutionary. Pearls were not soldiers. They were not leaders. They were servants. Yet Pearl's devotion to Rose was unlike anything the Empire could understand. She believed in Rose's vision completely. While other gems followed Rose because they hoped for a better future, Pearl followed because she had witnessed Rose's transformation firsthand. She had seen Pink Diamond's growing love for Earth. She had watched her choose compassion over conquest. Over time, Pearl became one of the rebellion's most skilled fighters. Elegant and precise, she fought with incredible speed. Her spear flashed through battlefields like a streak of light. Behind her courage was a fierce determination to protect the future Rose dreamed of creating. As the war continued, another extraordinary gem entered the story. Her name was Garnet. Or rather, Garnet would become her name, because the truth of Garnet's existence was unlike anything Gem Society had ever seen before. To understand why, we need to travel briefly away from the battlefields and toward a moment that changed Gem history forever. Among Homeworld's forces were two gems named Ruby and Sapphire. On paper, they could not have been more different. Rubies were soldiers, small and energetic, created specifically for combat. Sapphires were aristocrats, rare gems gifted with the ability to glimpse possible futures. The Empire expected them to remain within their assigned roles, and for a very long time they did. Then fate intervened. During one of the countless events surrounding the war, Ruby and Sapphire found themselves together in circumstances nobody had anticipated. In a moment of panic, emotion, and genuine connection, something extraordinary happened. The two gems fused. Fusion itself was not unusual. Many gems could temporarily combine into a larger form. But fusion within Gem Society was typically viewed as practical. It was a tool, a strategy, a means of increasing power. What happened between Ruby and Sapphire was different. Their fusion wasn't created for battle. It wasn't created because they were ordered to do so. It happened because they cared about one another. And when the fusion ended, something remarkable occurred. They wanted to become Garnet again. Not because they needed to, but because they chose to. For Homeworld, this was unthinkable. The Empire depended upon order and hierarchy. Two different gems choosing to remain fused out of love challenged everything their society believed. For Ruby and Sapphire, however, the experience changed their lives forever. Together they became Garnet, strong, confident, steady. A living symbol of love and self-determination. When Garnet eventually joined the Crystal Gems, Rose immediately recognized how important she was. Not simply because of her strength, but because of what she represented. Garnet was proof that gems could choose their own identities. She was proof that the future did not have to be dictated by tradition. In many ways, she embodied the very ideals the Crystal Gems were fighting to protect. As the years passed, the rebellion continued to grow. Yet despite their victories, the Crystal Gems faced enormous losses. Homeworld's resources seemed endless. For every battle won, another challenge appeared. For every victory celebrated, another sacrifice followed. The war stretched on for centuries. Entire regions of Earth became battlegrounds. Ancient gem structures rose and fell. Powerful warriors emerged on both sides. The conflict became so vast that later generations would remember it almost as a legend. But beneath all the battles and grand events, Rose carried a burden nobody else fully understood, the secret of who she truly was. Every Crystal Gem believed Rose Quartz was exactly who she claimed to be. A rebel leader fighting against the Diamond, a defender of Earth, a revolutionary willing to challenge an empire. None of them knew that the rebellion's leader and the youngest Diamond were actually the same person. And with every passing year, keeping that secret became more difficult. The war was reaching a turning point. A decision was approaching, one that would shock Homeworld, inspire the crystal gems, and alter the course of history for thousands of years to come. Soon the galaxy would hear news that seemed impossible. The news that rose quartz had shattered pink diamond, and nothing would ever be the same again. The announcement spread across the gem empire like a shock wave. From the grand halls of Homeworld to the most distant colonies among the stars, the same story was repeated again and again. Rose Quartz, the leader of the crystal gems, had shattered pink diamond. To gems, shattering was far worse than death. A shattered gem could not simply reform. Their existence was effectively ended forever. It was one of the gravest acts imaginable. The reaction was immediate. Yellow Diamond was furious. Blue Diamond was devastated. Across the empire, grief and outrage mixed together. The rebellion was no longer viewed as a troublesome resistance movement. It had become a personal attack against the ruling diamonds themselves. Any hope of a peaceful resolution disappeared overnight. What nobody realized, however, was that the story itself was a carefully constructed illusion. Pink Diamond had not actually been shattered. The event had been staged. Rose Quartz and Pearl had created the deception together, believing it was the only way to permanently free Earth from Homeworld's control. If the diamonds believed Pink Diamond was gone, perhaps they would eventually abandon the colony altogether. For a time, the plan appeared to work. The apparent loss of Pink Diamond shook the empire. Confusion spread throughout Homeworld's ranks. Many gems struggled to understand how such a powerful diamond could have fallen. The rebellion gained momentum, and the crystal gems continued fighting with renewed determination. Yet the diamonds were not willing to let Earth go. Instead, they became more dangerous than ever. The war grew darker. Battles became increasingly destructive. Entire landscapes were scarred by the conflict. Some places that appear throughout Steven Universe, ancient ruins, strange structures, and mysterious locations hidden across the globe, are silent reminders of those long-forgotten struggles. As the fighting intensified, countless gems were caught in the middle. Many soldiers had never chosen to be there. They had simply followed orders because that was what gem society expected of them. The longer the war continued, the more tragic it became. Friends found themselves on opposite sides. Loyal soldiers questioned their purpose. And throughout it all, Earth remained trapped between two futures. Then came the event that changed everything. The diamonds reached a terrifying conclusion. If they could not reclaim Earth, then they would ensure the crystal gems could never truly win. Gathering their immense powers together, White Diamond, Yellow Diamond, and Blue Diamond unleashed an attack unlike anything the planet had ever witnessed. A blinding wave of energy swept across Earth. Its effects were catastrophic. Thousands of gems were struck by the attack. But instead of being destroyed, many suffered something arguably worse. Their minds became damaged, their identities fractured, their forms twisted into monstrous creatures driven by confusion and instinct. The gems later called this tragedy corruption. In a single moment, much of the gem population remaining on Earth was transformed. Warriors who had once spoken and laughed became strange monsters wandering the planet. Friends could no longer recognize one another. Entire armies vanished. The battlefield fell silent. For the crystal gems, the aftermath was heartbreaking. The war they had fought for so long was effectively over. But victory came at a terrible cost. Everywhere they looked, they saw reminders of what had been lost. The corrupted gems remained scattered across Earth, trapped in forms they could not control and unable to return to the lives they once knew. Yet somehow a small group survived: Rose Quartz, Pearl, Garnet, and eventually another gem who would become one of the most beloved members of the crystal gems, Amethyst. Unlike many gems, amethyst emerged from Earth long after the worst of the war had ended. Deep within an abandoned kindergarten, she formed slowly beneath the surface before finally emerging into a world that felt strangely empty. She never experienced the Empire at its height. She never witnessed the early rebellion. Instead, she grew up surrounded by these surviving crystal gems and learned about the war through stories and memories. This made Amethyst different, where Pearl carried centuries of history and Garnet possessed remarkable wisdom. Amethyst often approached life with curiosity and humor. She was playful, energetic, and sometimes reckless. Yet beneath her carefree personality was a deep desire to belong, because unlike the others, Amethyst had been created by the very process that Rose had fought to stop. Even so, Rose loved her. The crystal gems accepted her, and together they slowly began building a new life on Earth. The war was over. Homeworld was gone. The corrupted gems remained scattered across the planet. And for the first time in thousands of years, Earth knew peace. Or at least, a fragile version of it. Because although the battles had ended, the secrets of the past had not. Rose Quartz still carried the truth about Pink Diamond. Pearl was forced to protect that secret. The diamond still mourned someone who was never truly gone. And somewhere far beyond Earth, Homeworld continued moving forward, unaware that the greatest mystery in its history remained unsolved. For the crystal gems, however, a new chapter was beginning. One that would eventually bring them into contact with the species Rose had grown to admire more and more over the centuries, humanity. And among all the humans Rose Quartz would meet, one would change her life forever. A kind-hearted musician named Greg Universe. For thousands of years, Rose Quartz had watched humanity grow. She had seen small settlements become towns and towns become cities. She had witnessed generations come and go, each living only a tiny fraction of the time a gem could experience. Yet rather than viewing humans as fragile, Rose found herself increasingly fascinated by them. Humans changed constantly. They learned, they dreamed, they made mistakes, and found ways to grow from them. Their lives were brief, but because of that, every moment seemed precious. To Rose, this was something Gem Society had never truly understood. Then one day, in the quiet coastal town that would later become Beach City, Rose met Greg Universe. He wasn't a warrior, a ruler, or someone destined to save the world. He was simply a young musician with a kind heart, an old van, and a habit of seeing people for who they truly were. Neither of them could have imagined it at the time, but their meeting would eventually lead to the birth of someone unlike anyone the universe had ever seen before. And with that, the age of ancient gem wars would slowly give way to a much more personal story. The story of Steven Universe. For thousands of years, Rose Quartz had fought to protect Earth. She had challenged an empire, survived a war that changed the fate of countless gems, and carried secrets that could alter history itself. Yet despite everything she had experienced, one of the most important chapters of her life began not on a battlefield, but on a quiet boardwalk beside the sea. Greg Universe was unlike anyone Rose had ever met. He wasn't immortal. He wasn't powerful. He didn't command armies or possess ancient knowledge. He was simply human. Yet that was exactly what fascinated Rose. Unlike gems, humans were free to reinvent themselves. They could change careers, change beliefs, make mistakes, and grow from them. Their lives were brief, but because of that, every moment carried meaning. The more time Rose spent with Greg, the more she fell in love with humanity. Not because humans were perfect, but because they weren't. Humans stumbled, they failed, they got hurt, yet somehow they continued moving forward. To Rose, there was something beautiful about that resilience. Over time, Greg and Rose grew closer. They spent countless days together exploring Beach City, talking beneath the stars, and sharing stories from two completely different worlds. Greg introduced Rose to music, human culture, and the simple joys of everyday life. In return, Rose shared pieces of herself that very few people had ever seen. For the crystal gems, this relationship was complicated. Pearl struggled more than anyone. For thousands of years, Pearl had devoted herself to Rose. She had fought beside her during the war, protected her secrets, and followed her through every triumph and tragedy. Watching Greg become an increasingly important part of Rose's life wasn't easy. At times, Pearl felt confused. At times, she felt jealous. And at times, she simply couldn't understand what Rose saw in humans. But despite these difficulties, life continued. The crystal gems remained Earth's guardians. They protected humanity from corrupted gems, monitored ancient gem technology, and quietly defended the planet from threats most people never even knew existed. To ordinary humans, Beach City was simply a peaceful coastal town. Few realized that powerful alien artifacts and ancient secrets rested just beyond the horizon. As years passed, Rose's love for humanity only grew stronger. She became fascinated by the idea of growth. Humans were constantly changing. Children became adults. Ideas evolved. Entire civilizations transformed over time. Gems, on the other hand, remained largely the same beings they had always been. Rose began to wonder if there was something she had been missing all along. Then she made a decision that would surprise everyone around her. Rose wanted to create new life, not in the way gems created life through kindergartens, not through colonization, not through the draining of a planet's resources. She wanted to create life through love. She wanted a child. This was unprecedented. No gem had ever done such a thing before. In fact, for Rose to bring a child into the world, she would have to make an enormous sacrifice. Her physical form and gemstone could not coexist with a human child. To create this new life, she would have to give up her own existence. It was a decision that would forever change the lives of everyone who knew her. Greg struggled to fully understand it. Pearl couldn't accept it. Even Garnet, who often seemed to understand things others could not, recognized how significant this moment would be. Yet Rose remained certain. She believed that creating this child would be worth it. She believed the future held something extraordinary. And so, after thousands of years of existence, Rose Quartz prepared to do something no gem had ever done before. She prepared to become part of someone else. Soon a child would be born. A child who was both human and gem. A child capable of bridging two worlds that had remained separate for thousands of years. A child named Steven Universe. And with his arrival, the long history of the crystal gems would enter an entirely new era. The day Steven Universe was born marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. For Greg, it was the arrival of his son. For the crystal gems, it was the loss of Rose Quartz. And for the universe itself, it was something entirely unprecedented. When Steven came into the world, Rose's physical form disappeared forever. In her place remained her gemstone, now resting within Steven's body. He carried part of her, yet he was not Rose. He was his own person, his own life, his own future. Still, for those who had loved Rose for thousands of years, accepting that truth would take time. The early years of Steven's life were peaceful compared to the ancient wars that had come before. He spent his childhood in Beach City, surrounded by people who cared deeply for him. Greg raised him with warmth and kindness, doing his best, despite often finding himself in situations no ordinary parent could have prepared for. After all, most parents don't have to wonder whether their child might accidentally activate ancient alien powers before breakfast. For a long time, Stephen seemed like a normal kid. Well, mostly normal. He laughed, played games, watched television, and explored Beach City like any curious child. Yet there were occasional reminders that he was different. Strange events seemed to happen around him. Ancient gem artifacts reacted to his presence. And every so often, the crystal gems would exchange worried glances, wondering when Rose's powers might finally emerge, because nobody truly knew what Stephen was capable of. There had never been a human-gem hybrid before. There were no examples to study, no history books to consult, no ancient records explaining how his powers would develop. Stephen was the first. And that uncertainty made everyone nervous, especially Pearl. Among the crystal gems, Pearl struggled the most with Rose's absence. Even years after Stephen's birth, she still found herself comparing him to the person she had lost. Sometimes she looked at Stephen and saw Rose's gemstone. Sometimes she heard echoes of Rose in his words. Yet Stephen was not Rose. And learning to accept that became one of Pearl's greatest emotional challenges. Garnet handled things differently. Steady and patient as always, she believed in Stephen almost immediately. While others worried about what he might become, Garnet focused on who he already was. She saw kindness in him, compassion, and curiosity, traits that reminded her of the best parts of Rose, yet belonged entirely to Stephen himself. Amethyst, meanwhile, quickly became something like an older sister. The two shared a playful energy that often led to adventures, mischief, and occasional chaos. Amethyst understood what it felt like to be different. She understood what it meant to struggle with identity and belonging. Because of that, she connected with Stephen in a way nobody else could. Together, the crystal gems became his family, not just guardians, family. As Stephen grew older, small signs of his powers began appearing. Sometimes they emerged when he was excited, other times when he was frightened or emotional. Unlike gems, whose abilities were generally stable, Stephen's power seemed closely tied to his feelings. One day, while spending time with the crystal gems, he accidentally summoned a magical shield from his gemstone. It was a simple moment, but it changed everything. For the first time, there was undeniable proof that Stephen had inherited Rose's abilities. The crystal gems realized they could no longer shield him from their world forever. Sooner or later, Stephen would need to understand who he was. He would need to learn about gems, about the war, about the responsibilities that came with his powers, and perhaps most importantly, about the legacy left behind by the mother he had never known. Thus began Stephen's training, not through harsh lessons or strict discipline, but through experience. The crystal gems took him on missions. They explored ancient gem ruins together. They recovered dangerous artifacts. They contained corrupted gems that still wandered Earth after thousands of years. With every adventure, Stephen learned a little more about the hidden world surrounding him. Yet what made Stephen different from the gems wasn't his powers, it was his heart. Whenever the crystal gems encountered enemies, Stephen's first instinct was rarely to fight. He wanted to understand people. He wanted to help them. He wanted to know why they were hurting. At first, this approach often seemed naive. After all, the universe could be dangerous. Many threats could not simply be talked away, or so everyone believed. But Stephen had inherited something from Rose that was far more important than strength. He had inherited empathy. And before long, that empathy would begin changing the lives of everyone around him, including gems who had once been considered enemies. One of the first major signs of this came through a gem named Peridot. Originally sent by Homeworld to investigate Earth, Peridot arrived as an antagonist. She viewed the crystal gems as criminals and considered Stephen nothing more than a strange anomaly. Yet as events unfolded, Stephen did something unexpected. Instead of treating her as an enemy to be defeated, he treated her as a person worth understanding. Slowly, through patience and kindness, he began breaking through the walls she had built around herself. And without realizing it, Stephen was beginning to prove something Rose had always believed. People can change. As Stephen spent more time with Peridot, something remarkable happened. The gem who had arrived on Earth as a loyal servant of Homeworld slowly began questioning everything she had been taught. She witnessed the friendships shared by the crystal gems. She experienced freedom for the first time. Most importantly, she saw that Earth was not the worthless colony she had been told it was. Through Stephen's kindness, Peridot discovered that her value did not depend on her rank or purpose. It was the beginning of one of the most important transformations in the series. But while Stephen was helping former enemies become friends, a far greater threat was approaching. Hidden beneath Earth's surface was an ancient secret left behind during the Gem War, one capable of destroying the entire planet if awakened. The peaceful days in Beach City were about to come to an end, and Stephen's greatest challenge yet was waiting just beyond the horizon. By the time Stephen had befriended Peridot, life in Beach City had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. A gem who once served Homeworld was now spending her days learning about Earth, arguing about television shows, and discovering what it meant to make her own choices. For Stephen, it was proof that understanding someone could be far more powerful than fighting them. But even as new friendships formed, an ancient danger continued growing beneath the planet itself. The secret had been hidden for thousands of years. During the Gem War, Homeworld had planted something deep within Earth's core. It was known as the Cluster, a massive, forced fusion made from countless shattered gem fragments. Unlike Garnet, whose fusion was built upon love and trust, the Cluster was created through suffering. Thousands of broken gem pieces had been combined together against their will. The result was a being so enormous that if it ever fully emerged, the planet itself would be torn apart. For thousands of years, nobody knew the true scale of the threat. Then Peridot discovered it. At first, she struggled to explain what she had learned. The Cluster was unlike anything the crystal gems had ever faced. It wasn't simply another monster or another corrupted gem. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. According to everything Peridot knew, its emergence was inevitable. The news shook everyone. For Pearl, it was another reminder that the consequences of the Gem War had never truly disappeared. For Amethyst, it was a frightening glimpse into Homeworld's cruelty. For Garnet, whose future vision often revealed countless possibilities, it was one of the rare situations where even she seemed uncertain. And for Stephen, it presented a problem unlike any he had encountered before. How do you save a planet from something buried deep inside it? The crystal gems searched desperately for solutions. They explored ancient facilities. They studied old gem technology. They followed every lead they could find. Yet time continued slipping away. Meanwhile, Peridot underwent a transformation of her own. Having spent most of her life believing in Homeworld's ideals, she now found herself questioning everything. The empire she had once admired seemed increasingly cruel. The diamond she had been taught to respect suddenly appeared distant and uncaring. And Earth, the planet she had once viewed as insignificant, had become her home. One moment in particular marked a turning point. While communicating with Yellow Diamond, Peridot finally voiced her own opinion. She defended Earth. She argued that the planet was valuable. She challenged one of the most powerful beings in existence. It didn't go well. Yellow Diamond dismissed her completely. To the Diamond, Earth remained a failed colony, nothing more. For perhaps the first time in her existence, Peridot openly rejected Homeworld. It was a small act compared to the rebellion Rose had once led, but it carried enormous significance. Peridot was choosing her own path. Stephen couldn't have been happier. He had always believed people could change. Now he was watching it happen. As the cluster continued developing beneath Earth, Stephen eventually discovered something extraordinary. While exploring its fragmented consciousness, he realized that the shattered gem pieces inside the cluster were still aware. They were frightened, confused, trapped. Most people would have viewed the cluster as a monster. Stephen saw victims. Once again, his greatest strength wasn't power, it was compassion. Rather than trying to destroy the cluster, Stephen reached out to it. He listened. He comforted the fragmented minds trapped within the fusion. He treated them with kindness despite the danger they represented. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. The cluster agreed to remain dormant. Earth was saved, not through violence, not through conquest, but through empathy. It was a victory unlike any the crystal gems had ever achieved. Yet while one crisis ended, another was already beginning. Far beyond Earth, Homeworld had noticed something unusual. Peridot had stopped reporting. Ancient gem facilities were becoming active again. And perhaps most alarming of all, Rose Quartz's gemstone was now being carried by a young hybrid who should not have existed. The diamond's attention was slowly returning to Earth. At first, the signs were subtle. Strange transmissions, unexplained activity, ancient systems awakening after centuries of silence. The crystal gems knew something was coming, even if they couldn't yet see the full picture. Then a new gem arrived, a gem unlike Peridot, unlike almost anyone Stephen had ever met. Her name was Jasper. Powerful, relentless, and fiercely loyal to Homeworld, Jasper represented everything the crystal gems had once fought against. She viewed Earth as a conquered world. She viewed Rose Quartz as a criminal. And she viewed Stephen as a living reminder of everything she hated. Where Stephen sought understanding, Jasper sought victory. Where Stephen offered friendship, Jasper offered conflict. Their paths were destined to collide. Yet even Jasper's arrival was only part of a much larger story, because another gem was approaching Earth as well. A gem connected directly to the ancient war. A gem who had spent thousands of years trapped and suffering. A gem carrying grief, anger, loneliness, and wounds that had never fully healed. Her name was Lapis Lazuli. Unlike Peridot, who slowly learned to love Earth, Lapis had every reason to resent it. She had been caught in the chaos of the Gem War, imprisoned for thousands of years inside a magical mirror, and left alone with her pain for longer than most minds could endure. When Stephen finally freed her, he offered her kindness, just as he had done for so many others. But some wounds take longer to heal than others. Lapis's story would soon intertwine with Jasper's in ways nobody could predict. Their choices would create one of the most tragic and complicated relationships in Steven Universe lore. And as tensions continued rising between Earth and Homeworld, Stephen would find himself facing challenges that no amount of training could prepare him for. The peaceful days of Beach City were beginning to fade. The past was catching up to the crystal gems. Old secrets were resurfacing. Ancient enemies were returning. And somewhere among the stars, the diamonds were slowly turning their attention back toward the planet they believed had taken Pink Diamond away from them. As Homeworld's attention returned to Earth, the lives of the crystal gems grew increasingly complicated. For years they had lived in relative peace, protecting the planet from corrupted gems and ancient dangers left behind by the war. Now, however, the galaxy itself seemed to be moving once again. Long-forgotten conflicts were resurfacing, And Stephen was slowly finding himself at the center of events that had begun thousands of years before he was born. Lapis lazuli struggled more than anyone to adjust. While Peridot had found excitement in discovering Earth, Lapis found reminders of loss. She had spent millennia trapped inside a mirror, unable to explain her innocence or escape her prison. Every new friendship carried the risk of new pain. Every moment of happiness felt fragile. Stephen did his best to help her, offering patience and understanding, but healing was never simple. Some wounds could not disappear overnight. Then Jasper returned. Determined as ever to defeat the crystal gems, Jasper represented everything Homeworld expected a gem to be: strength, loyalty, obedience. She viewed compassion as weakness and saw Earth's defenders as traitors. Yet beneath her confidence lay frustration and anger. The world she believed in was changing around her, and she refused to accept it. The conflict between Jasper and the crystal gems eventually led to one of the most emotional moments in the series. In order to stop Jasper, Lapis made a painful choice. The two fused together into a powerful fusion known as malachite. Unlike Garnet's fusion, which was built upon love and trust, malachite was unstable and unhealthy. It became a symbol of pain, control, and emotional struggle. Trapped together beneath the ocean, both gems suffered tremendously. For Stephen, watching this unfold was heartbreaking. Once again, he was confronted by a problem that could not simply be solved through strength. The people involved were hurting. They were trapped by fear, anger, and trauma. Stephen wanted to help everyone, but sometimes helping someone required more than good intentions. As these events unfolded, Stephen's own powers continued developing. He learned to summon protective bubbles, heal damaged objects, and communicate in ways no gem had ever been able to before. Yet each new ability only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Was he truly Rose Quartz's son? Or was he somehow Rose herself? It was a question that followed him everywhere. Many gems who encountered Stephen struggled to see him as his own person. Some looked at him and saw Rose. Others saw Pink Diamond's gemstone. Very few saw Stephen for who he actually was. This burden became heavier as Stephen encountered more gems connected to the past. Ancient allies, forgotten enemies, and survivors of the war all carried their own opinions about Rose Quartz. Some admired her, some hated her, some mourned her. And Stephen often found himself dealing with emotions that did not belong to him. At times, he felt responsible for mistakes he had never made. At times, he felt pressured to live up to impossible expectations. Yet despite everything, he continued choosing kindness. That choice would soon lead him toward one of the biggest revelations in the history of Steven Universe. While exploring old records and uncovering hidden truths about the Gem War, Stephen began noticing inconsistencies in the story he had always been told. Certain events didn't quite make sense. Certain details seemed strangely incomplete. Pearl often became uncomfortable whenever specific questions were asked. Garnet and Amethyst also seemed uncertain about parts of the past. The mystery grew larger with every discovery. Why had Rose Quartz supposedly shattered Pink Diamond? How had she managed to accomplish something nobody else could? Why did so many pieces of the story feel hidden? Unknown to Stephen, he was slowly approaching a truth that would shake the foundations of everything he believed about his family. Meanwhile, Homeworld itself was changing. For thousands of years, Blue Diamond had carried immense grief over Pink Diamond's apparent death. Yellow Diamond buried her sorrow beneath endless work and authority. White Diamond remained distant and mysterious, watching events unfold from the center of Gem civilization. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew that the gem they mourned had never truly disappeared. And soon Stephen would find himself traveling farther from Earth than ever before, stepping directly into the heart of Homeworld's empire. There he would encounter the diamonds not as distant legends, but as real individuals burdened by loss, regret, and centuries of unresolved pain. The secrets of rose quartz were beginning to unravel. The mystery of pink diamond was nearing its answer, and the revelation waiting ahead would forever change how Stephen, the crystal gems, and even the diamonds understood their own history. As Stephen continued uncovering fragments of the past, the pieces slowly began fitting together. Every hidden record, every uncomfortable silence, and every unanswered question pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. The story of rose quartz was not what anyone believed it to be. Far beyond Earth, the diamonds were preparing for events that would soon bring Stephen face to face with the legacy of Pink Diamond. The answers he sought were finally within reach, and when the truth emerged, it would transform friends into skeptics, enemies into allies, and rewrite the entire history of the Gem War. By the time Stephen began piecing together the truth about the past, he had already experienced more than most people could imagine. He had befriended former enemies, saved Earth from the cluster, helped corrupted gems, and learned that the universe was far larger and more complicated than he had ever believed. Yet none of those discoveries would prepare him for what came next. The mystery surrounding rose quartz had followed Stephen for years. Everywhere he went, he encountered fragments of the same story. Gems spoke about Rose with admiration, grief, anger, or confusion. Some remembered her as a hero. Others remembered her as a criminal. But the more Stephen learned, the harder it became to reconcile those different versions of the same person. Something wasn't adding up. The official story claimed that rose quartz had shattered Pink Diamond during the Gem War. It was the event that changed everything. The loss of Pink Diamond had devastated Homeworld and transformed a rebellion into a tragedy that echoed across thousands of years. Yet as Stephen uncovered ancient memories and hidden records, cracks began appearing in that narrative. The truth finally emerged piece by piece rather than all at once. At first, the possibility seemed impossible, then unlikely, then unavoidable. Rose quartz had never shattered Pink Diamond because rose quartz was Pink Diamond. The revelation sent shockwaves through everything Stephen thought he knew. The leader of the crystal gems and the youngest diamond were not two separate individuals. They were the same person. Pink Diamond had created the identity of rose quartz in order to protect Earth. She had led a rebellion against her own empire, and eventually she had staged her own shattering to convince Homeworld that the colony had been lost forever. Suddenly, countless mysteries made sense. Why Pearl had been so secretive. Why certain details of the war never aligned. Why Rose always seemed burdened by things she could never fully explain. For Stephen, however, understanding the truth was only the beginning. Accepting it was much harder. The revelation forced him to reconsider everything he knew about his mother. Rose had always been remembered as a compassionate hero who fought for freedom. Now Stephen had to grapple with the reality that she had also been Pink Diamond, a ruler whose actions had contributed to the suffering of countless gems. The truth was complicated. Rose was neither entirely hero nor entirely villain. She was flawed. She made mistakes. She hurt people. She tried to do better, and in many ways, that complexity made her feel more human than ever. Not everyone reacted well to the revelation. Pearl carried centuries of emotions she had never been allowed to express. Garnet struggled with the fact that her closest friend had hidden such an enormous secret. Amethyst questioned parts of the history she thought she understood. Across the galaxy, gems who learned the truth found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about identity, loyalty, and forgiveness. Perhaps nobody was affected more than Blue Diamond and Yellow Diamond, For thousands of years they had mourned Pink Diamond. They had built entire lives around grief. They had convinced themselves that rose quartz had taken someone they loved away forever. Now they were being forced to confront a far stranger reality. Pink Diamond had never truly disappeared. Her gemstone lived on within Stephen. This realization set the stage for Stephen's journey to Homeworld. No longer was he mere defending Earth from distant threats. He was stepping directly into the center of gem civilization itself. Homeworld was unlike anything he had ever seen. Massive structures stretched toward the sky. Endless armies of gems carried out their assigned functions. Everything was organized with incredible precision. Yet beneath that order lay something else: sadness. For all its power, Homeworld felt trapped in the past. The Empire had spent thousands of years trying to preserve itself exactly as it was. Change was feared. Individuality was discouraged. Gems were expected to remain within the roles assigned to them from the moment they emerged. Stephen immediately recognized the problem. Homeworld suffered from the same rigid thinking Rose had once tried to challenge. As he met more gems, he discovered countless individuals struggling under expectations they never chose. Some feared failure. Others feared being different. Many had never even considered the possibility that they could decide their own futures. Stephen understood those feelings better than anyone. After all, he had spent much of his life trying to prove that he was not simply an extension of rose quartz. He was Stephen. And slowly, through conversations, friendships, and moments of genuine compassion, he began helping others understand that truth as well. Yet the greatest challenge still awaited him. At the center of Homeworld stood White Diamond, the most powerful gem in existence. Mysterious, ancient, and terrifying. Unlike blue and yellow, White Diamond seemed completely certain of her own worldview. She believed everything had a proper place. She believed flaws should be corrected. She believed perfection was the natural order of the universe. To White Diamond, Stephen was not Stephen at all. He was Pink Diamond. A confused version of Pink Diamond, perhaps, but Pink Diamond nonetheless. And until Stephen confronted that belief, neither he nor Homeworld could truly move forward. The fate of Gem Society, the future of the diamonds, and Stephen's own understanding of who he truly was would soon depend upon a single moment of truth. Stephen's confrontation with White Diamond became one of the most important moments in the entire history of Steven Universe. For thousands of years, White Diamond had viewed herself as the embodiment of perfection. She believed every gem had a specific role to fulfill, and that any deviation from that role represented a flaw that needed correcting. In many ways, she embodied the very system Rose Quartz had rebelled against all those centuries ago. When Stephen finally stood before her, he quickly realized that White Diamond wasn't truly listening to him. No matter what he said, she continued treating him as Pink Diamond. To her, Stephen's identity was merely a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. She couldn't imagine a reality in which Pink Diamond had genuinely become someone new. For Stephen, this was deeply frustrating. His entire life had been shaped by other people's expectations. Some wanted him to be Rose Quartz. Others wanted him to be Pink Diamond. Some viewed him as a hero, while others saw him as a threat. Yet very few people simply accepted him as Stephen. And now even White Diamond refused to see him. The confrontation eventually reached a breaking point. White Diamond used her immense powers in an attempt to separate Stephen from his gem. For a brief moment, it appeared she might succeed. Stephen's gem emerged from his body, forming a separate being made entirely of light. What happened next changed everything. White Diamond expected Pink Diamond to reappear. Instead, she witnessed something impossible. The gem was Stephen. The human was Stephen. Every part of him was Stephen. There was no hidden pink diamond waiting beneath the surface. There was no rose quartz trapped inside. The person standing before her was exactly who he claimed to be. Steven Universe. For the first time, White Diamond was forced to confront a truth she could not ignore. Her assumptions were wrong. Her certainty was misplaced. The perfection she had spent thousands of years pursuing had blinded her to reality. It was a remarkably simple lesson. People are allowed to change. People are allowed to become something new. And people cannot be defined solely by their past. The realization affected not only White Diamond, but the other diamonds as well. Blue Diamond, Yellow Diamond, and White Diamond had spent millennia trapped by grief, guilt, and expectations. Stephen's presence forced them to examine themselves in ways they never had before. Slowly, change began spreading through Homeworld. The rigid structures of gem society started loosening. Gems gained greater freedom to express themselves. Roles became less restrictive. Individuals who had spent their entire lives following predetermined paths finally began exploring who they wanted to be. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Thousands of years of tradition could not disappear instantly. But it was a beginning. For the first time in gem history, genuine progress seemed possible. Meanwhile, Stephen returned to Earth as something of a hero. The conflict with the diamonds had ended peacefully. Homeworld was changing. Corrupted gems could finally begin receiving help. Ancient wounds that had remained open for thousands of years were slowly starting to heal. Everything seemed to be falling into place. For a while, life in Beach City felt calmer than ever. The crystal gems continued protecting Earth, but the galaxy no longer stood on the edge of war. Peridot continued embracing her new life. Lapis slowly worked through her trauma. Garnet remained a source of wisdom and stability. Pearl continued learning how to move forward without being defined solely by her past. Amethyst became increasingly comfortable with her own identity. And Stephen finally had a chance to breathe. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Because beneath the surface, something was changing. For years, Stephen had focused entirely on helping others. He had solved problems, repaired relationships, ended conflicts, and supported countless people through difficult moments. Whenever someone else was hurting, Stephen immediately rushed to help. What he rarely did was ask himself how he was feeling. The truth was that Stephen had carried an enormous burden for most of his life. He inherited a war he never started. He inherited secrets he never created. He inherited expectations he never asked for. Again and again, he put other people's needs ahead of his own. At first, this seemed admirable. Eventually, it became dangerous. As Stephen grew older, he began noticing changes within himself. Emotions felt stronger than before. Stress became harder to manage. Certain memories lingered longer than they used to. The pressure of constantly being needed was beginning to take its toll. For the first time, the greatest challenge Stephen faced would not come from Homeworld. It would come from within. And that challenge would form the heart of the final chapter in his story. As peace settled across the galaxy, everyone assumed Stephen's journey was finally complete. The wars were over. The diamonds were changing. Old enemies had become friends. Yet beneath the surface, Stephen was carrying years of unresolved emotions that nobody, not even he himself, fully understood. For so long, he had helped everyone else heal. Now, whether he realized it or not, it was his turn. And the story that began with ancient gem wars was about to become something far more personal. For most of his life, Steven Universe had been the person everyone relied upon. Whenever there was a crisis, he stepped forward. Whenever someone was hurting, he listened. Whenever a friendship was falling apart, he tried to bring people back together. Time and time again, Stephen became the emotional center of the world around him. It was a role he embraced willingly, because helping others felt natural to him. Yet as the years passed, something quietly began happening beneath the surface. The universe was changing. The diamonds were reforming gem society. Corrupted gems were being healed. Homeworld was evolving. Earth was safer than it had been in thousands of years. For the first time since Stephen was born, there were no major threats demanding his attention. Ironically, that was exactly when his struggles began. When life is filled with constant emergencies, there is little time to reflect. But when the chaos fades, people are often left alone with thoughts and emotions they have been carrying for years. Stephen suddenly found himself facing a question he had never seriously considered before. Who was he when nobody needed saving? The answer wasn't easy. For so long, Stephen's identity had been connected to helping others. He was the peacemaker, the problem solver, the bridge between humans and gems. But now his friends were finding their own paths. The people around him were growing and changing. Some were leaving Beach City to pursue new opportunities. Others were becoming more independent than ever before. Instead of feeling happy about these changes, Stephen found himself feeling strangely lost. He tried to ignore it at first. After all, everyone else seemed fine. Why should he complain? But emotions rarely disappear simply because they're ignored. As the months passed, Stephen began noticing signs that something was wrong. He became more anxious. Small frustrations felt larger than they should have. Situations that once seemed manageable suddenly became overwhelming. Even moments that should have made him happy sometimes left him feeling uneasy. The crystal gems noticed the changes, though they didn't immediately understand what was happening. Pearl assumed Stephen simply needed time to adjust to a quieter life. Garnet encouraged him to focus on the present rather than worrying about the future. Amethyst tried cheering him up through humor and companionship. Greg remained supportive, always ready to listen whenever Stephen wanted to talk. Yet none of them fully realized how much pressure Stephen had been carrying. Because Stephen himself didn't fully realize it. For years he had experienced one extraordinary event after another. He had faced monsters, intergalactic rulers, ancient secrets, and impossible responsibilities. Each challenge demanded his attention. Each victory pushed him forward. Rarely did he stop to process what those experiences had actually done to him. Now those memories were catching up. The fear, the stress, the responsibility, the expectation that he always needed to be strong. It all remained inside him. And because Stephen's powers were closely connected to his emotions, his internal struggles began manifesting in alarming ways. His abilities became increasingly unpredictable. Strong emotions caused sudden surges of power. Moments of anxiety produced unexpected reactions. The more overwhelmed he felt, the harder it became to control himself. For perhaps the first time in his life, Stephen couldn't solve the problem through kindness alone. This wasn't an enemy he could befriend. It wasn't a misunderstanding he could resolve. It wasn't a conflict between other people. It was his own pain. One of the most difficult aspects of Stephen's struggle was that he felt guilty for having it at all. Compared to the suffering many others had endured, his problem seemed insignificant. The diamonds had carried grief for thousands of years. Lapis had endured unimaginable isolation. Pearl had spent centuries wrestling with loss. Who was Stephen to complain? Yet pain doesn't disappear simply because someone else has suffered too. Eventually, the pressure became impossible to ignore. The more Stephen tried convincing himself that everything was fine, the worse things became. He became increasingly emotional, increasingly frustrated, increasingly afraid of what was happening to him. And perhaps, most painfully of all, he began feeling disconnected from the people he loved. The same friends who had supported him throughout his life suddenly seemed difficult to talk to. Not because they didn't care, but because Stephen didn't know how to explain what he was experiencing. He had spent so much time being everyone else's source of support that asking for help felt unfamiliar. It was a deeply human struggle, one that many people watching the series immediately recognized. Because sometimes the hardest thing a person can do isn't helping someone else. It's admitting they need help themselves. As Stephen's emotional state continued worsening, the consequences became impossible to hide. The powers that once allowed him to protect others were now reflecting the turmoil within him. And unless he learned to confront those feelings, the future he had worked so hard to build could begin slipping away. The final chapter of Steven Universe was no longer about saving the galaxy. It was about healing the person who had spent years trying to save everyone else. As Stephen's inner pressure continued building, it began to affect everything around him in subtle but unsettling ways. Small emotional triggers led to sudden bursts of uncontrolled power. Objects would warp or break without intention. Moments of stress felt heavier, almost like the world itself was reacting to what he was feeling inside. The crystal gems noticed it more clearly now, and for the first time, they weren't sure how to help him. Greg tried reaching out in the simplest ways he knew. Long conversations, quiet evenings, gentle reminders that Stephen didn't have to carry everything alone. Pearl, still learning how to navigate her own emotions, struggled to find the right words but remained present, hoping that simply being there would be enough. Garnet continued offering calm reassurance, encouraging Stephen to trust that the future still held possibilities he couldn't yet see. Amethyst, in her usual way, tried to lighten the mood, but even she could sense that this wasn't something laughter alone could fix. Stephen, however, kept insisting he was fine. It wasn't that he was trying to lie, it was that he genuinely wanted to believe it. He had spent so long being the person who fixed things for everyone else that the idea of being the one who needed fixing felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. So instead of opening up, he pushed forward. He tried harder. He smiled more. He buried the discomfort deeper, hoping it would eventually disappear on its own. But emotions don't vanish just because they are ignored. They build. And eventually, they break through. That breaking point came gradually at first. Moments where Stephen felt disconnected from himself. Times when his reflection didn't feel entirely familiar. Situations where he reacted more strongly than he expected, followed by confusion and guilt. Each incident seemed small on its own, but together they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. His powers, once a source of hope and protection, became increasingly unstable. Shields formed unintentionally. Healing abilities triggered without control. Emotional surges caused transformations in the environment around him. The stronger his feelings became, the less predictable everything felt. The crystal gems realized something serious was happening, but they struggled to define it. Stephen wasn't facing an external enemy. There was no gem invasion, no ancient weapon awakening, no cosmic threat to fight. Instead, he was facing something far more complicated, himself. Eventually, Stephen began withdrawing. Not dramatically at first, just slowly. He spent more time alone. He avoided conversations that felt too heavy. He smiled less often. He stopped sharing things the way he used to. The people around him noticed, but no one wanted to push too hard for fear of making things worse. Yet silence, too, can be heavy. The weight Stephen carried began manifesting in ways he couldn't control. His emotions, long suppressed, started surfacing in waves. Fear, anger, sadness, exhaustion. All of it blending together into something he didn't fully understand. And because Stephen had always defined himself by his ability to help others, losing control over himself felt terrifying. He began to wonder things he had never allowed himself to think before. What if he wasn't actually helping anyone anymore? What if everything he had done was not enough? What if, despite all his efforts, he was still just a burden? These thoughts didn't arrive all at once. They crept in slowly, quietly, becoming harder to ignore over time. And because Stephen had no clear outlet for them, they remained trapped inside him, growing heavier with each passing day. The turning point came when even his closest relationships began feeling strained. Conversations that once felt natural now felt difficult. He worried about saying the wrong thing. He worried about disappointing people. He worried that if he showed too much of what he was feeling, he might become someone others no longer recognized. That fear created distance, and that distance deepened the pain. Eventually, Stephen reached a moment where even he could no longer pretend everything was fine. The emotional pressure, built up over years of responsibility, expectation, and unresolved trauma, finally reached its limit. And for the first time in his life, Steven Universe began to fall apart. Not in a dramatic instant, but slowly, in a way that felt heavier with every passing moment, like something inside him was finally reaching its breaking point after years of being held together by sheer will. The world around him didn't end, the battles didn't resume, and no ancient enemy returned. Instead, it was something quieter and more personal. The realization that even someone who had saved everyone else could still struggle to save himself. When Stephen finally reached his breaking point, it didn't look like a single dramatic collapse. It looked like distance, like silence, like a version of him, slowly stepping back from the world he had spent his entire life trying to protect. The boy who once ran toward danger without hesitation now hesitated even in simple conversations. The weight he had carried for years as Earth's protector, as Rose Quartz's son, as the bridge between gems and humans, had finally become too heavy to ignore. At first, those around him thought it was just a phase. Everyone in Stephen's life had grown used to him being strong, patient, and endlessly understanding. So when he became quieter, they assumed he just needed rest. Greg tried to give him space while still staying close. The crystal gems tried to reassure him in their own ways, each struggling to understand what more they could possibly offer someone who had already done so much for everyone else. But Stephen wasn't simply tired. He was overwhelmed by years of emotions he had never fully processed. Every battle he had ended without resolution, every person he had comforted while ignoring his own pain, every expectation placed on him because of who he was born from, all of it began surfacing at once. It wasn't one memory or one event. It was everything together, finally demanding to be felt. His powers, once symbols of hope and protection, became unstable reflections of his inner state. Small emotional triggers caused sudden bursts of energy. His healing abilities no longer responded predictably. Even simple moments of stress began affecting the environment around him. The more he tried to hold himself together, the more fragile everything became. It was as if the universe itself was mirroring his emotional state. What made it harder was that Stephen still believed he needed to stay strong for everyone else. That belief had been built into him over years of saving others. So instead of reaching out, he withdrew further. He stopped talking about how he felt. He avoided situations where he might break down. He smiled when he could. But even that started to feel like something he was doing for others rather than himself. The crystal gems noticed, but none of them had ever dealt with something like this before. Pearl struggled with guilt, wondering if she had contributed to Stephen's burden by keeping secrets about Rose. Garnet remained calm but uncertain, seeing possible futures that no longer felt as clear as they once did. Amethyst tried to stay close in her own casual way, but even she could tell that this wasn't something she could simply joke away. Greg, more than anyone, felt helpless watching his son drift further into himself. Stephen began questioning everything. Not just his role as a hero, but his identity itself. If he wasn't saving the world, then what was he supposed to be? If people no longer needed him in the same way, did that make him less valuable? These thoughts didn't come from a single moment of doubt, but from years of accumulated pressure finally reaching the surface. And because he had never learned how to separate his worth from what he could do for others, he began feeling like he was losing himself entirely. Eventually, the emotional strain became too much to contain. Stephen started having episodes where his feelings overwhelmed his control. His powers reacted unpredictably, not as attacks, but as expressions of internal distress. It was no longer about enemies or external threats. It was about his own mind struggling to hold everything together. At the same time, something important began to shift. For the first time, those around him stopped trying to fix him and started trying to understand him. Conversations became less about solutions and more about listening. The crystal gems, who once saw Stephen as someone they needed to protect, began realizing that he had spent his entire life protecting them instead. It was a slow and imperfect process. There were misunderstandings, moments of frustration, and times when Stephen still pulled away. But beneath all of it, something new was forming. A recognition that even heroes need support. Even saviors need space to exist as ordinary people. And Stephen, for the first time, began to understand that he didn't have to carry everything alone. But before that understanding could fully take root, there was still one final step he had to face. One last confrontation, not with gems from Homeworld, not with ancient secrets, but with the version of himself he had been running from for so long. Because healing was not going to come from saving the world again. It was going to come from finally learning how to save himself. As Stephen's condition deepened, it became harder for him to distinguish between what was real and what was being shaped by his emotions. His powers, once something he could rely on instinctively, now felt like extensions of his inner instability. A sudden memory could trigger a surge of energy. A moment of guilt could ripple outward into the physical world. It wasn't that he was losing control in a violent sense, but rather that he was no longer able to separate his feelings from reality itself. The crystal gems tried to adapt to this new version of Stephen, but it wasn't easy for anyone. Pearl often found herself overthinking every interaction, afraid that saying the wrong thing might push him further away. Garnet continued to offer steady reassurance, but even she admitted that the future felt less certain than before. Amethyst stayed close, sometimes sitting beside Stephen in silence when the words didn't feel helpful. Greg, meanwhile, carried a quiet sadness of his own, realizing that no matter how much love he offered, he couldn't simply remove what Stephen was going through. Stephen himself began to reflect more on his past than ever before. Not just the battles or the victories, but the emotional cost of always being the one others depended on. He remembered the times he smiled when he felt overwhelmed, the moments he agreed to help when he was already exhausted, the countless situations where he pushed his own feelings aside because someone else needed him more. At the time, those choices had felt natural, even necessary. Now they felt like pieces of a larger pattern he had never noticed forming. The idea that he might be more than just Rose Quartz's legacy or Pink Diamond's successor was something he struggled to fully accept. For so long, his identity had been shaped by other people's stories about him, a symbol of peace, a bridge between worlds, a child born from sacrifice. But beneath all of that, he had rarely been given space to simply exist as Stephen, without expectation attached to him. As these realizations built up, his emotional state continued to fluctuate. There were moments where he felt clarity, where he believed he understood what he needed to do, and then there were moments where everything felt too heavy again, where even small decisions felt overwhelming. This instability made everyday life increasingly difficult, and even the simplest situations sometimes carried unexpected emotional weight. One of the most difficult aspects of this period was the isolation Stephen began to feel, even when surrounded by people who cared about him. It wasn't that he was physically alone, but emotionally he felt disconnected. He worried that others saw him as fragile. He worried that they would start treating him differently if they knew how much he was struggling. That fear kept him from opening up fully, which only deepened the distance between him and those closest to him. At the same time, the people around him were also changing in response to his struggles. They began reflecting on their own roles in his life. Pearl confronted her long history of secrecy and emotional dependence. Garnet questioned whether always appearing certain had made it harder for Stephen to express uncertainty himself. Amethyst thought about what it meant to grow without expecting herself to stay the same forever. Greg tried to reconcile the fact that loving someone sometimes meant accepting that you couldn't fix their pain. Slowly, the dynamic between them began shifting from guardianship to mutual understanding. For the first time, Stephen wasn't just being supported as someone who needed protection. He was being seen as someone whose experiences mattered on their own terms, separate from his role as a hero or savior. But even as these changes began, Stephen still hadn't fully faced the core of his struggle. He could see the symptoms, the emotional overwhelm, the instability in his powers, the distance growing between him and others. What he couldn't yet do was confront the deeper question underneath it all. The question that had been forming quietly since childhood but had never been answered. Who was he, if not the person who saved everyone else? And until he could face that question directly, the weight he carried would continue to shape him in ways he could no longer ignore. The final step of his journey was approaching, whether he was ready or not. The final weight on Stephen was not a single moment of collapse, but the realization that he could no longer define himself through saving others alone. For the first time, he understood that being strong for everyone else had slowly made him forget how to be there for himself. And in that quiet understanding, the path forward finally began to take shape, not as a mission, not as a duty, but as something far more human. The chance to heal slowly, honestly, and without needing to carry the universe on his shoulders. By the time Stephen reached the final chapter of his journey, there were no more ancient wars to fight, and no looming intergalactic invasions waiting at the edge of the horizon. The universe, for the first time in a very long time, was not demanding him to be a hero. Instead, it was quietly asking him to be something far more unfamiliar, just himself. At first that sounded simple, but Stephen quickly realized it was the hardest thing he had ever faced. Without crises to solve or people to rescue, he was left alone with his own thoughts. And those thoughts were not always gentle. Every memory of pressure, every expectation placed on him since childhood, every moment where he had swallowed his own feelings to support someone else, all of it began rising to the surface with no distractions left to push it away. The crystal gems remained by his side, but even they understood this was different. There was no enemy to fight, no artifact to recover, no corrupted gem to heal. What Stephen was facing could not be solved through missions or teamwork alone. It required something slower, more uncertain, and deeply personal. It required him to face himself without the armor of responsibility he had worn for so long. Greg watched his son with a kind of quiet concern that only a parent could fully understand. He had always admired Stephen's compassion, his willingness to help others even at his own expense. But now he could see the cost of that kindness. Stephen had spent so much of his life being strong for everyone else that he had never learned how to be vulnerable without feeling like he was failing. Pearl struggled with guilt during this time, revisiting memories of Rose and the secrets she had carried. She began to understand that some of Stephen's burdens were not only inherited through power, but through silence. Garnet, ever steady, reminded the group that the future was not fixed, and that even uncertain paths could lead somewhere meaningful. Amethyst, in her own way, stayed close without demanding explanations, offering presence instead of solutions. Stephen himself spent a lot of time alone during this period, not out of rejection of others, but because he needed space to understand what was happening inside him. He would sit quietly in the beach city, listening to the waves, watching people live their ordinary lives, and trying to understand why he felt so distant from the simplicity they seemed to have. For so long, his life had been defined by extraordinary events that ordinary moments now felt unfamiliar. Slowly, he began to recognize something important. He had spent years believing that his value came from what he could do for others, saving the world, fixing problems, holding everything together when things fell apart. But when he removed all of that, when he stripped away the responsibilities and expectations, he was left with a question he had never properly answered. Who was he without all of that? The answer did not come immediately. In fact, it came through discomfort, through moments of confusion, through times when he felt overwhelmed without knowing exactly why. But within that discomfort, something new was forming, a quiet understanding that his emotions were not obstacles to overcome, but signals to be listened to, that his pain was not a weakness, but a part of him that had been ignored for too long. For the first time, Stephen began to speak more openly about what he was feeling, not in dramatic outbursts, but in small, honest moments. He admitted when things felt heavy. He admitted when he was unsure. He admitted when he needed help instead of trying to push through everything alone. These moments were not easy, but they were necessary, and slowly they began to change the way the people around him responded. The crystal gems listened differently now. Not as guardians trying to guide a child, but as individuals recognizing another person who had carried too much for too long. Greg stopped trying to fix everything with reassurance and instead focused on simply being present. Pearl began to accept that not all truths needed to be perfect or resolved to be meaningful. Garnet continued to offer calm perspective, but with more openness to uncertainty. Amethyst reminded Stephen that he did not have to be defined by anything other than who he chose to be, and in that environment, something very gradual began to shift inside Stephen. Not an instant healing, not a sudden transformation, but a slow recentering. A recognition that he was allowed to exist outside of crisis, that he did not need to earn his place in the world by constantly saving it. That being Stephen was enough, even on days when nothing extraordinary was happening. Still, the journey was not complete. There were moments when the old pressure returned, times when he felt the urge to take responsibility for things that were not his to carry, times when he questioned whether he was doing enough, but now, instead of immediately pushing those feelings away, he began to pause, to acknowledge them, to sit with them rather than running from them. And in those pauses, something important began to grow. A new understanding of himself that was not built on legacy or expectation or duty, but on choice. The choice to continue, to rest, to speak, to feel, and to exist as someone whole rather than someone defined by what others needed from him. This was not the end of Stephen's story in the sense of finality, but the beginning of something quieter and more enduring. A life no longer shaped by ancient wars or inherited burdens, but by the simple act of learning how to live as himself. And for the first time, that was enough. Even as Stephen began to understand himself more deeply, healing was never a straight path. Some days felt lighter, almost peaceful, where he could laugh with his friends and enjoy the quiet rhythm of Beach City without feeling the weight of expectation pressing on him. On those days, it almost felt like everything had finally settled into place. But then there were other days, quieter and heavier, where old feelings returned without warning, reminding him that healing was something he would have to keep choosing again and again. What made Stephen's journey different from everything that came before it was that there was no enemy left to defeat. No final gem threat to overcome. No galactic war demanding his attention. Instead, the challenge was internal, and therefore far more unpredictable. It came in waves of emotion, in sudden moments of doubt, in the quiet fear that he might slip back into the role of carrying everyone else before remembering to carry himself. The crystal gems learned to adjust alongside him. They stopped treating him like someone who needed constant protection and started recognizing him as someone growing into his own independence. Their relationship became more balanced, more honest, and in many ways more real than it had ever been before. Stephen was no longer just Rose Quartz's legacy or Earth's protector. He was a person learning how to exist beyond those labels. Greg remained a steady presence throughout it all, often reminding Stephen that it was okay not to have everything figured out. Their bond deepened in a quieter way, shaped not by dramatic events, but by simple conversations, shared silence, and mutual understanding. Greg had always seen Stephen as his son, but now he also saw him as someone becoming fully himself, separate from everything that came before. Beach City, too, seemed different during this time, not because the world itself had changed, but because Stephen's relationship with it had. The town that once felt like the center of cosmic conflict now felt like a place where life could simply exist without expectation. Ordinary moments began to feel meaningful in ways they never had before. A conversation with a friend, the sound of the ocean at night, the comfort of familiar places that did not demand anything in return. Slowly, Stephen began to understand that peace was not something that arrived all at once. It was something built in fragments through repeated choices to stay present, to stay honest, and to stay connected even when things felt uncertain. There were still days when he struggled, but those days no longer defined him in the same way. They were no longer proof that something was wrong with him. They were simply part of being human. And in that realization, something fundamental shifted. For so long, Stephen had been moving forward because he believed he had to. Because the world needed him to. Because there was always something or someone waiting for him to fix. Now, for the first time, he began to move forward because he wanted to understand what life could look like without constant crisis shaping every decision. That shift did not erase the past. It did not undo the wars, the secrets, or the pain. But it allowed those experiences to exist as part of him without controlling him. He could remember rose quartz, pink diamond, the crystal gems, and everything that had led him here without feeling like he had to become any of them. He could simply be Stephen, carrying his history without being trapped by it. As this understanding deepened, Stephen started reconnecting with the people around him in a more grounded way. Not as someone responsible for holding everything together, but as someone participating in relationships where care flowed both ways. He could ask for help without feeling like he was failing. He could say no without guilt. He could exist without needing to justify his presence. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like freedom. Not the kind of freedom that comes from rebellion or escape, but the quieter kind. The kind that comes from acceptance. The kind that comes from no longer needing to be anything other than what you are in the present moment. Stephen's story had begun with ancient civilizations, interstellar empires, and impossible expectations placed on a child who never asked for them. But it was ending here, not with destruction or victory, but with understanding, a slow return to self, a quiet rebuilding of identity, a recognition that even someone who had carried the weight of worlds could learn to set it down. And in that space, something new finally had room to grow. Not the story of a savior, not the legend of a diamond reborn, and not the burden of a boy who had to hold the universe together, but the quiet life of someone learning that being alive is not about fixing everything around you, but about learning how to exist within yourself without fear. Steven Universe's journey didn't end with perfection or answers, but with acceptance. And in that acceptance, he finally found something he had been searching for all along without even realizing it. So as the stars continued to shine over Beach City, and the waves keep moving gently against the shore, Stephen's story lingers not as an ending, but as a reminder that even after saving everyone else, it is still okay and often necessary to learn how to save yourself. And with that, I wish you all a peaceful sleep until we meet again, only on the Sleep Hours. Good night, everyone.